The desert shows no mercy. It is a vast, empty canvas where the sun paints with fire and the wind etches with dust. You might think the heat is the greatest enemy, the most insidious threat to life. But in the Bedouin world, there is a more ancient, more terrifying force, the sandstorm. To the uninitiated, it is a sudden, violent death, a monster of wind and dust that can swallow the sun and bury you alive. It comes on a whisper and leaves behind a grave of sand. It is a force so complete, so overwhelming, that it erases all trace of life, all memory of the path you followed. To most, a sandstorm is a death sentence. But for the Bedouins, it was a test of skill, a profound challenge not to fight the storm, but to survive within it. They were not modern people with weather apps or satellite forecasts. Their signal was the desert itself, and their survival was a masterpiece of observation and instinct. They knew the storm was coming by the behavior of their most trusted companions, the camels. These animals, perfectly evolved for desert life, possessed an uncanny sixth sense. Long before the first gust, the camels would turn their backs to the wind, lie down in a huddle, and refuse to move, their long legs folding beneath their bodies like a collapse. They would begin to breathe differently, a low, guttural rhythm that signaled deep unease. For the Bedouins, this was the first, most reliable warning. They also watched the air itself. It would grow still and humid, a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt like a prelude to a great, destructive event. The horizon, once a clear line between the earth and the endless blue sky, would blur into a hazy, ominous yellow, a subtle shift in color that spoke of immense, swirling dust far away. The very light of the sun would change, losing its sharp, golden quality and taking on a dull, sepia tone. The air would taste different, metallic and dry, carrying a phantom scent of grit. The wind was the next harbinger. It would arrive as a low moan, a distant rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once. Then, the first gust, a sudden, powerful push that whipped the top layer of sand into a chaotic dance. This was the moment of truth. This was when the frantic scramble for survival began. And finally, the wall. It was not a gradual arrival, but a sudden, solid thing. A massive, churning cloud of dust and grit, stretching from the ground to the sky, moving with the force of a train. It blotted out the sun, turning day into a strange, suffocating twilight. The sound of it was deafening, a roar of a million tiny particles hitting everything in their path. It was a wall of pure chaos, and in that moment, there was no time for panic. A Bedouin's life depended on a deep, almost unconscious instinct to read the signs and act with a swift, cold precision that left no room for error. Their mind was no longer a human brain, but an extension of the desert itself, moving in concert with its brutal, unyielding rules. For a Bedouin, this moment was not a surprise. It was an inevitable part of the desert cycle. They had spent their lives preparing for it, not by building concrete shelters or inventing new tools, but by perfecting their relationship with the environment. Their entire existence was a rehearsal for this singular event. Every fold of their clothing, every design of their tent, every daily habit was an act of preparation. They were an entire culture built around the art of surviving the unsurvivable. And when the sandstorm came, they were ready. They would not flee. They would not fight. They would simply become a part of the storm itself, an invisible, patient presence waiting for the fury to pass. Their secret was not in resisting the storm's power, but in yielding to it completely. In that act of surrender, they found their strength. The first rule of a sandstorm is not to hide, but to make yourself small. The densest and most damaging part of the storm is a few feet above the ground, where the largest and most abrasive sand particles are carried by the wind. To stand tall is to expose yourself to the full, blinding force of the wind and the relentless hail of sand that can tear at skin and blind you in minutes. The Bedouins understood this with an innate, physical knowledge. The moment the storm's first gust hit, they would drop to their knees and then to the ground immediately, wrapping their bodies and heads in their cloaks and blankets. This was not a panicked flailing, but a precise, controlled motion, a reflex honed over generations. Their clothing, the loose, layered abaya, was not just a garment. It was a shield, an all-purpose survival tool. The multiple layers of fabric acted as a buffer, protecting their skin from the stinging sand and helping their bodies maintain a stable temperature. The loose fit created pockets of air that insulated them from the extreme temperature fluctuations of the storm, the quick drop in heat as the sun was blocked, and the rise in temperature from the sheer friction of the wind. With their bodies pressed low to the ground, they would then use the terrain to their advantage. They would dig shallow depressions in the sand with their hands or feet, not to completely hide, for that was impossible, but to use the earth as a barrier against the worst of the wind's force. They would lie face down or on their side, keeping their heads pointed away from the wind. This posture minimized their surface area, preventing the wind from tearing away their coverings and giving it nothing to push against. The face, the most vulnerable part of the body, was given special attention. Every exposed inch was covered, especially the nose, mouth, and eyes. The keffiyeh, their traditional headscarf, was not just a piece of cloth. It was a multi-layered mask, a sophisticated filter. They would pull it over their nose and mouth, its dense weave acting as a sieve, a barrier against the fine dust that could choke the lungs and damage the respiratory system. Breathing in this fine dust was a path to slow, suffocating death. The keffiyeh allowed them to breathe, albeit shallowly, without inhaling the killer dust. They would moisten the inner layer of the cloth with a few drops of precious water, creating a cool, moist filter. This simple act was a matter of life or death, preventing dehydration and heatstroke from the dry, superheated air. This small, intentional use of water was a testament to their deep understanding of thermodynamics. The evaporation of that moisture directly on the skin provided a critical cooling effect. If they were near their tent, the response was slightly different, but no less immediate. They would scramble inside and secure the flaps, anchoring the ropes deep into the sand with their feet. The Beit al-Sha'ir, the house of hair, was their fortress. Its tight weave, made from goat hair, was designed to keep out wind and dust, its dark color absorbing the heat and creating a stable interior. Inside, they would huddle together, sharing warmth and conserving energy. The fabric, while not airtight, allowed enough air to prevent suffocation while blocking the worst of the dust. Their entire world shrank to the small, dark space within the tent. They didn't eat, they barely drank. The goal was to outlast the storm, to exist in a state of suspended animation, their bodies and minds focused on nothing but survival. The wind could howl, the sand could lash against the fabric, but inside, they were calm. This was not just a physical act of survival, but a psychological one, a state of non-existence that allowed them to wait out the end of the world. A sandstorm is not a sprint, it's a siege. It is the ultimate test of patience and inner discipline. Once they were low and covered, the Bedouins did what they did best. They waited. They entered a state of profound, almost meditative stillness. In the desert, panic is not just a psychological weakness, it is a physical danger. Fear raises the heart rate, increases sweating, and wastes precious energy and moisture. The Bedouins knew that every panicked breath, every frantic movement, was a step closer to death. They learned to control their breathing, to slow it down to a near imperceptible rhythm. Every movement was a risk. Every extra breath was a loss of precious moisture. The human body is a furnace, and every action, no matter how small, generates heat. In the suffocating embrace of a sandstorm, this self-generated heat could be fatal. So, they became still. They became silent. They became as inert as the sand around them. Their lives were not just in the stillness, but in the silence. The roar of the wind was deafening, a monstrous sound that erased all other reality. The world became a symphony of howling and the pelting of sand and grit against their coverings. They would use their blankets and cloaks to muffle the sound, staying focused on the feeling of their own bodies, on the slow, deliberate pulse of their own blood. They learned to feel the rhythm of the storm, the lulls and the sudden, violent gusts, without needing to see it. It was a complete surrender of the senses, a turning inward to the only thing they could control, themselves. This was the true Bedouin discipline, the ability to quiet the mind, to calm the body, and to simply exist in the midst of chaos. Their greatest ally was their tent, the Beit al-Sha'ir. For a family, the tent was their fortress. The goat hair fabric was tightly woven, designed not just to provide shade, but to be a robust barrier against wind and dust. Inside, They would huddle together, sharing warmth and conserving energy. The fabric, while not airtight, allowed just enough air to prevent suffocation while blocking the worst of the dust. This was a critical balance. A fully sealed structure would suffocate its inhabitants. An open one would offer no protection. The Bedouin tent was a masterpiece of breathable, yet protective, design. Their entire world shrank to the small, dark space within the tent. The air inside might be thick with dust, but it was nothing compared to the fury outside. They didn't eat, they barely drank. The goal was to outlast the storm, to exist in a state of suspended animation, their bodies and minds focused on nothing but survival. The wind could howl, the sand could lash against the fabric, but inside, they were calm. This was not just a physical act of survival, but a psychological one, a state of non-existence that allowed them to wait out the end of the world. For days, they could remain in this state. The storm could rage for hours or for a full day, and they would not move, except for the most essential of needs, handled with a speed and efficiency born of necessity. The camels, their faithful companions, would also be still, their bodies offering a final, living wall against the wind. In this quiet, dusty world, time lost its meaning. There was no sun, no night sky, no horizon. There was only the sound and the feeling of the wind. This practice of stillness was a profound act of defiance against the desert's power. The desert demanded action, constant movement, and vigilance. But in the storm, the Bedouin responded with profound inaction. This was their secret weapon, their ultimate defense. They were not just surviving the storm. They were becoming a part of it, a still point in a turning world. When the storm finally lifted, it was not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding halt. The wind would die down, the roar would fade into a whisper, and the world would slowly reappear from a veil of dust. The silence that followed was as shocking as the noise that preceded it. It was a complete and absolute stillness, broken only by the shifting of the sand and the sound of their own cautious breaths. The first sight was always the most profound. The landscape was utterly changed. Dunes had shifted, their familiar shapes altered into new, alien forms. Tracks were erased, and landmarks were gone, swallowed whole by the moving earth. The camels, buried up to their haunches, would slowly rise, like ancient creatures emerging from a long slumber, shaking off the immense weight of the sand. The Bedouins would emerge from their coverings and shelters, shaken but alive. Their first task was to assess the damage. They would check their animals, their supplies, and their fellow travelers with a quiet, efficient urgency. Then, they would immediately begin to reorient themselves. Their knowledge of the stars and the sun, combined with an intuitive understanding of the newly formed landscape, allowed them to re-establish their direction. A sandstorm didn't just move sand, it reset the map. For anyone else, this would be a death sentence, a complete loss of all reference points. But for the Bedouin, it was an opportunity to showcase their mastery of the environment. They could read the new dunes, the subtle signs in the wind-sculpted sand, and the direction of the setting sun to find their way. This ability was not just a skill, it was a way of life. A sandstorm wasn't just a natural event, it was a reset button. It wiped the desert clean, erasing all traces of the past, and forcing a complete reliance on instinct and ancient knowledge. It was a test of faith in their own abilities and in the wisdom passed down through generations. They didn't fear the storm because they understood its nature. They didn't fight it. They yielded to it, becoming another shape in the landscape, waiting for the wind to pass. For them, survival was a dance with the elements, not a battle against them. And in that surrender, they found their strength. The experience was a physical and spiritual cleansing. It humbled them, reminding them of the desert's immense power and their own small place within it. It reinforced their core philosophy, that life in the desert is not about conquering it, but about becoming a part of its relentless, beautiful, and terrifying rhythm. The aftermath was a time of rebuilding and silent reflection. They would dig out their buried belongings, repair any damage to their tent, and prepare to move on. The sense of community was at its highest in the moments after a storm. They would help one another, sharing what they had, their shared survival, forging an unbreakable bond. The storm was a reminder that they were not individuals, but a single, resilient unit against the vastness of the desert. The silence after the storm was a sacred time, filled with unspoken gratitude and a renewed respect for the power of the natural world. It was a time to remember that the desert was not an enemy, but a teacher. It taught them patience, stillness, and the profound art of endurance. And in the end, it was the desert itself that revealed the true meaning of survival. It wasn't about strength, but about quiet, precise, and unwavering discipline.